At dawn on June 6, 1944, thousands of vulnerable Allied soldiers struggle through the Normandy surf. Yet, just miles inland, hundreds of German tanks sit completely idle. The crews are awake. The engines are ready. Local commanders are staring at their maps, desperately requesting permission to strike, while the beaches are still fragile. But the tracks do not turn. Germany's armor is paralyzed, not by enemy fire, but by a rigid chain of command that forbids movement without distant authorization. Why did the German military keep its most lethal weapons locked away during the exact hours they were needed most? This is not another broad retelling of the Normandy campaign. We are not looking at the sprawling naval logistics of the Allied Armada or the isolated struggles of paratroopers dropping into the dark. Instead, this is a granular autopsy of a catastrophic command failure. For decades, the narrative of D-Day has focused heavily on the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. But on the morning of June 6th, the German military held a brutal trump card. They possessed the armored divisions necessary to drive a wedge into the fragile landing zones and potentially shatter the invasion before it could consolidate. Yet, the anticipated crushing counterattack never materialized when it mattered most. Germany did not lose the crucial first hours of D-Day because it lacked tanks. It lost those hours because the tanks themselves, and the authority to actually deploy them, were physically and bureaucratically separated. As Allied landing craft steadily emptied onto the beaches, unloading artillery, fuel, and rapid reinforcements, German panzer crews sat next to silent radios and ringing field telephones, tangled in a web of competing jurisdictions. The steel was in France, but the permission to release it was held hostage by a broken chain of command. This paralysis was not merely an accident of that specific morning, nor was it simply the result of a sleeping dictator in Bavaria. The failure was baked into the system by design. To understand why German armor remained frozen while the fate of the Western Front was being decided on the coast, we must first look at the bitter strategic compromise that fractured the German military architecture long before the first Allied boot touched the sand. By the spring of 1944, the German High Command in France was acutely aware of an impending catastrophe. They knew an Allied invasion across the English Channel was inevitable, and they knew the Atlantic Wall alone, the vast, continuous network of concrete bunkers, naval mines, and barbed wire stretching along the coast, would never be enough to hold the line indefinitely. Concrete could only delay an invading army. Only heavy armor could destroy it. The key to German survival in the West rested entirely on the deployment of their panzer divisions. But precisely how and where to use those tanks sparked one of the most consequential, bitter, and ultimately disastrous strategic disputes of the Second World War. On one side of this debate stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the tactical commander responsible for defending the northern French coastline. Rommel brought with him a traumatic, hard-learned lesson from his recent campaigns in North Africa. He had personally witnessed the terrifying, unrelenting evolution of Allied air power. He knew with absolute certainty that the moment the sun burned off the morning mist, the skies over the French countryside would belong entirely to American and British fighter bombers. To Rommel, the idea of holding tank reserves hundreds of miles inland, intending to march them to the coast after an invasion began, was tactical suicide. He argued that any large armored column attempting to navigate the narrow French road network in daylight would be spotted, strafed, and bombed into burning scrap metal long before its tracks ever reached the front line. Therefore, Rommel's doctrine was absolute. The war would be won or lost on the beaches. The invasion had to be crushed at the water's edge in the very first hours while the enemy was still disorganized and struggling in the surf. To achieve this, he demanded that the panzer divisions be deployed directly behind the beaches, dispersed along the coastline, ready to counterattack immediately under the cover of darkness or coastal fog. But this vision directly and violently clashed with the perspective of his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Supreme Commander West. Rundstedt represented the classical, orthodox Prussian military tradition. When he looked at the map of occupied Europe, he did not see a single predictable battlefield. He saw a terrifying vulnerability. The German military was tasked with defending a 3,000-mile coastline, spanning from the freezing waters of the Netherlands all the way down to the mountainous Spanish border. To Rundstedt, Rommel's plan of stringing out highly mobile armored divisions in small packets along the beaches was a profound strategic error. It was a classic cordon defense, a brittle, extended perimeter that violated every fundamental principle of concentrated armored warfare, leaving the tanks weak everywhere and strong nowhere. Furthermore, Rundstedt was paralyzed by the fear of Allied deception. If the German command committed their coastal armor the moment a landing was reported, what would happen if that landing was merely a feint? The tanks would be pinned down in combat, unable to quickly extract themselves, while the true, massive invasion force landed entirely unopposed miles down the coast. Rundstedt's solution was the exact opposite of Rommel's. He wanted to hold a massive, centralized armored reserve, a heavy, concentrated fist known as Panzer Group West, stationed deep inland near Paris, safely out of range of naval artillery. His plan was to let the Allies land, wait patiently until the true center of gravity was definitively identified, and then unleash a unified, devastating counterstroke to sweep the invaders back into the sea in one massive blow. These were two highly logical, deeply rational military doctrines. Rommel was entirely correct about the lethal reality of Allied air supremacy. Rundstedt was entirely correct about the strategic danger of a diversionary landing and the necessity of concentrated force. But crucially, these two plans were mutually exclusive. You could not simultaneously hold a massive reserve deep inland and have your tanks waiting on the beaches. A definitive choice had to be made. Instead, the decision was handed over to Adolf Hitler, who arbitrated the dispute from his mountain retreat in Bavaria and made the single most disastrous choice possible. He compromised. Refusing to fully back either of his top commanders, Hitler arbitrarily split the armored forces in France, inadvertently creating a bureaucratic labyrinth that would doom the German defense before a single shot was fired. The resulting architecture of command was a masterpiece of dysfunction. The panzer divisions were divided into different administrative categories, effectively scattering the authority to use them. A small handful of armored units were assigned directly to Rommel's Army Group B. This included the 21st Panzer Division, positioned dangerously close to the Normandy coast, near the city of Caen. Rommel had the local authority to move these specific units, but because the forces had been split, they were far too small to execute the kind of immediate, overwhelming counterattack he knew was necessary to secure the beaches. Meanwhile, the bulk of the heavy armor, the formidable formations Rundstedt wanted for his centralized strike, were indeed kept inland. But Rundstedt was stripped of the authority to control them. The most powerful and elite formations, including the heavily equipped 1st SS Panzer Division, the mechanized infantry of the Panzer Lehr Division, and the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were designated as the OKW Reserve. They were subordinated directly to the Armed Forces High Command in Germany. This distinction on a military flowchart carried catastrophic real-world implications. It meant that Rundstedt, the supreme commander in the West, was legally forbidden from ordering his most powerful weapons into battle. Rommel, commanding the beaches, could not touch them either. The authority to start the engines of the OKW Reserve rested exclusively with Hitler himself. The physical reality of this compromise meant that the tanks and the authority to move them were separated by hundreds of miles of fragile telephone wire and layers of bureaucratic hesitation. To move a single tank from these elite divisions, a local commander on the coast would have to realize he was under attack, draft a formal request, and send it up the wire to his corps commander. The corps would evaluate the situation and pass it to the regional army level, who would relay it to Rommel's headquarters. Rommel's staff would then have to petition Rundstedt in Paris. Rundstedt, lacking the authority to issue the order, would then have to telephone the High Command in Berchtesgaden. There, the operations staff would evaluate the intelligence, debate the likelihood of a diversionary trap, decide if it was worth waking the Führer, and then wait for his personal, verbal approval before sending the movement order all the way back down that exact same fragile chain. This fractured, multi-layered system was built on a foundation of suspicion and a desire for centralized political control rather than operational efficiency. It assumed that a modern, multi-front amphibious invasion would unfold slowly enough to allow for hours of debate, telephone calls, and careful deliberation across hundreds of miles. It was a deeply fragile mechanism, a ticking time bomb intricately wired by the German command itself. And this exact bureaucratic structure, with its heavily armed tanks locked firmly in place, was waiting in the dark, primed to collapse the moment the first Allied paratroopers began falling into the fields of Normandy. The bureaucratic tripwire was triggered before the sun even came up, Shortly after midnight on June 6th, isolated reports began trickling into German command posts. Confused sentries described parachutes dropping out of the low clouds over the Cotentin Peninsula. Telephone lines buzzed with frantic, contradictory updates. Were they downed bomber crews, a localized commando raid, or the vanguard of the main invasion? In Paris, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, was awakened with the news. While others hesitated, paralyzed by the conflicting intelligence, Rundstedt immediately sensed the scale of the threat. The sheer volume of paratrooper drops, combined with localized jamming of radar stations, convinced him that this was not a minor diversion. The moment he had feared was unfolding, and he knew that hesitation would be fatal. He needed armored boots on the ground, moving toward the coast under the cover of darkness, before Allied air superiority could turn the dawn into a slaughterhouse. At 4:30 a.m., taking desperate initiative in the face of a rapidly escalating crisis, Rundstedt bypassed the rigid protocols. He ordered two of the most powerful formations in the Strategic Reserve, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, to immediately break camp and begin a forced march toward the Normandy coast. He commanded them to move out at once, intending to smash the Allied airborne landings before they could consolidate. For a brief, fleeting window, the German military machine functioned exactly as it should have. The orders reached the division headquarters. Crews were roused from their bunks. Engines coughed to life, spewing thick diesel smoke into the pre-dawn air. Massive columns of Panthers and Panzer IVs began to line up on the French roads, their tracks grinding against the pavement, ready to close the distance to the vulnerable beaches. If these columns had been allowed to continue, they would have arrived in the immediate aftermath of the initial landings, crashing into the Allied beachheads while they were still fragile, disorganized, and entirely lacking heavy anti-tank weapons. But the labyrinthine command structure Hitler had built would not tolerate unauthorized initiative. Rundstedt had overstepped his bounds. As a matter of procedure, his staff sent a routine teletype message to the Armed Forces High Command in Berchtesgaden, informing them that the OKW reserve divisions were on the move. When the message arrived at Hitler's headquarters, it triggered immediate and catastrophic bureaucratic pushback. The operations staff, led by General Alfred Jodl, was entirely unconvinced by Rundstedt's localized panic. Sitting hundreds of miles away in the safety of the Bavarian Alps, staring at static maps, they remained obsessed with the idea of a diversion. They believed the Normandy drops were merely a feint designed to draw German armor away from the true, massive invasion they were certain would land further north at the Pas-de-Calais. More importantly, Jodl recognized a blatant violation of protocol. Rundstedt had ordered the movement of the Strategic Reserve without the direct, explicit permission of the Führer. And the Führer, having taken a sleeping pill, was currently resting, with strict standing orders not to be disturbed. At 6:30 a.m., just as the first waves of American landing craft were dropping their ramps onto Omaha and Utah beaches, the High Command issued a devastating counter-order. They explicitly countermanded Rundstedt. The authorization was revoked. The elite panzer divisions were ordered to halt their advance immediately. Out on the French roads, the radios crackled with the new directive. The engines were throttled down. The massive columns ground to a halt. As the sun began to rise over Normandy, burning off the morning mist and revealing a clear sky soon to be filled with Allied fighter bombers, hundreds of Germany's most lethal tanks sat parked on the roadside, their crews watching the horizon, ordered to wait for a phone call from a man who was still asleep. While the strategic reserves were abruptly halted by Berchtesgaden, a different drama was unfolding closer to the coast. Rommel's Army Group B possessed only a fraction of the total armored force, but they did control the 21st Panzer Division. Stationed around Caen, just a short drive from the British and Canadian landing beaches, this unit represented the most immediate, localized, armored threat to the entire invasion. Unlike the heavy reserve, the 21st Panzer did not legally require Hitler's permission to move. They were the one force, uniquely positioned and authorized, to execute the exact kind of immediate, crushing counterattack Rommel had envisioned. But localized authority did not equal effective command. The 21st Panzer Division found itself paralyzed not by a sleeping dictator, but by a catastrophic breakdown in regional communication and conflicting priorities. The division commander, Edgar Feutinger, was initially absent from his headquarters when the first reports of airborne landings arrived. By the time he returned and grasped the situation, the chain of command was already fraying. He commanded a formidable force, over 100 tanks and a significant complement of mechanized infantry. But without clear, unified direction from higher regional staffs, he was fighting blind. Instead of a concentrated, aggressive thrust toward the vulnerable beaches, the 21st Panzer was fed into the battle piecemeal. Initially, elements of the division were ordered eastward to counter the British airborne landings near the Orne River, pulling them away from the critical amphibious assault zones. Hours later, as the severity of the beach landings became undeniable, the orders were frantically reversed. The tanks were commanded to turn around, navigate through the chaotic, congested road networks around Caen, and drive north toward the coast. This hesitation and redirection cost the division the crucial hours of darkness. By the time the main armored spearhead finally organized and began its push toward the British sector at Sword Beach, the sun was high in the sky. The tactical reality had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer attacking disorganized infantry struggling in the surf. They were met by elements of the British 3rd Infantry Division, which had already established anti-tank positions, and were soon hammered by the devastating firepower of Allied naval artillery anchored just offshore. A brief, terrifying wedge was driven toward the sea, but without overwhelming numbers or coordinated support, the attack stalled. The single local armored asset, the one tool legally available for immediate use, had been blunted by its own command structure before it could strike a decisive blow. Further inland, the regional army staffs overseeing the defense of Normandy, the 7th Army and the 84th Army Corps, were drowning in a rising tide of localized panic. Telephones rang constantly, delivering increasingly frantic reports from coastal strongpoints that were being overrun. The commanders on the ground could hear the massive, rolling thunder of the naval bombardment and clearly see the sheer scale of the Allied armada stretching across the horizon. To the officers staring at the maps in Normandy, the situation was utterly unambiguous. This was the main invasion, and their positions were rapidly disintegrating. They desperately needed the strategic reserves. They needed the massive armored fist of Panzer Group West that had been halted on the roads earlier that morning. Frantic requests were pushed up the chain of command, begging for the release of the Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr divisions. Yet, as these requests reached the higher echelons, specifically Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris and the Armed Forces High Command in Bavaria, they collided with a wall of institutional skepticism. The problem was not that the High Command didn't believe a landing was happening. The problem was that they fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. The ghosts of Allied deception operations, particularly Operation Fortitude, haunted the German map rooms. The elaborate Phantom Army, allegedly commanded by George Patton across from the Pas-de-Calais, had deeply infected German strategic thinking. The High Command was terrified that the Normandy landings were merely an elaborate, highly costly diversion, a massive feint designed specifically to draw the heavy panzer reserves away from the true, decisive blow expected further north. This fear made the officers in Berchtesgaden exceptionally hesitant to commit their most valuable assets. Every frantic plea from Normandy was met with demands for more confirmation, more clarity, more absolute proof that this was not a trap. They wanted to wait for the situation to fully develop before playing their final card. To the regional commanders watching their coastal defenses collapse, this demand for absolute certainty was indistinguishable from operational suicide. While the German command paralyzed itself with doubt, the psychological and physical reality on the beaches was undergoing a radical transformation. When the first waves of American, British, and Canadian troops hit the sand at dawn, they felt incredibly vulnerable. Every soldier had been briefed on the lethal capability of German armor. They expected that at any moment, the roar of Maybach engines would signal a massive, armored counterattack designed to sweep them back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, the anticipated Panzer assault never materialized. The silence of the German heavy armor began to profoundly alter the momentum of the day. The initial, desperate anxiety of the landing forces slowly transformed into a growing, aggressive confidence. The beaches, initially contested and fragile, began to function as massive, industrialized unloading zones. Every hour that passed without a concentrated German counterattack allowed the Allies to physically alter the battlefield. Landing craft, unharassed by enemy tanks, systematically dumped their cargo onto the sand. Sherman tanks churned through the surf, providing immediate, heavy fire support for the infantry. Artillery pieces were hauled ashore and quickly positioned to fire inland. Ammunition dumps expanded. Field hospitals were established. Fresh waves of infantry poured onto the beaches, replacing the initial casualties and pushing inland to secure the exits. The fragile toehold was rapidly solidifying into a robust, heavily armed bridgehead. Back in the German command centers, the requests for the strategic reserves continued their agonizing crawl up the bureaucratic ladder. The mechanism Hitler had designed was functioning exactly as intended, demanding centralized approval for strategic movements. By mid-morning, the pleas from Rundstedt's staff in Paris had reached General Alfred Jodl in Berchtesgaden. Jodl, viewing the war through the lens of the High Command's deep-seated fear of deception, remained unconvinced. He looked at the intelligence reports and concluded that the situation in Normandy, while serious, did not yet warrant the commitment of the OKW reserve. He felt the local forces should be able to contain the bridgehead until the true Allied intentions became clear. Crucially, Jodl possessed the authority to release the reserves on Hitler's behalf, but he chose not to exercise it. Instead, he adhered strictly to protocol. He insisted that the decision was of such strategic magnitude that it required the personal approval of the Führer, and the Führer was still asleep. Jodl refused to wake him. This decision, or rather this refusal to make a decision, perfectly encapsulated the fatal flaw in the German command structure. Caution, adherence to protocol, and a fear of centralized reprisal superseded operational urgency. At every level, from the regional staffs demanding more proof to Jodl refusing to wake his superior, the hesitation appeared rational within the context of their specific responsibilities. But collectively, these rational delays created a catastrophic pause, effectively neutering the German military's most powerful weapon at the exact moment its use was critical. Out on the French roads, the physical cost of this bureaucratic delay was compounding with every passing minute. The elite divisions of the OKW Reserve, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, remained exactly where they had been halted hours earlier. The engines were cold. The crews, exhausted by the frantic start and abrupt stop, rested beside their vehicles. The delay was not merely a loss of time, it was a physical degradation of combat power. When Rundstedt had initially ordered them to move before dawn, the tanks could have navigated the roads under the protective cloak of darkness. They could have closed the distance to the beaches with minimal interference from the air. But now, the sun was high in the sky. The morning mist had vanished. The airspace over Normandy was completely dominated by Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons and Thunderbolts, continuously patrolling the road networks, searching for any sign of German movement. The conditions that Rommel had so accurately feared were now a brutal reality. The tanks were no longer a hidden, imminent threat. They were massive, stationary targets, highly vulnerable the moment they attempted to move in daylight. Every hour they remained parked, waiting for a phone call from a Bavarian mountain, their potential effectiveness plummeted. The bureaucratic machine had not just delayed the counterattack, it was actively ensuring that when the order finally came, the tanks would be forced to advance through a gauntlet of aerial destruction toward an enemy that was growing stronger by the minute. It was not until 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the administrative logjam finally broke. Adolf Hitler had awoken. Briefings were held, intelligence was digested, and the Supreme Commander finally conceded that the situation in Normandy required a heavy response. The authorization that Gerd von Rundstedt had desperately initiated 12 hours earlier was officially granted. The High Command released the OKW Reserve. Down the fragile network of field telephones and teletype machines, the fateful order descended back through the command tiers, from Bavaria to Paris to the regional corps, and finally out to the idle armored columns waiting on the French roads. The engines of the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions roared back to life. The tracks began to turn. But military orders do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in time, and the time for this specific operation had expired. By the late afternoon of June 6th, the strategic window to destroy the invasion at the water's edge had permanently slammed shut. The bureaucratic delay had fundamentally altered the physical nature of the target the German armor was supposed to attack. If the panzers had been allowed to continue their forced march at dawn, they would have slammed into chaotic, lightly armed infantry units struggling through the surf, tangled in barbed wire, and completely devoid of heavy support. Instead, the delayed authorization forced the German armored crews to drive directly into a mature, rapidly solidifying bridgehead. The beaches they were now ordered to counterattack no longer resembled vulnerable landing zones, By the time the German tracks finally hit the pavement, the Allies had physically transformed the coastline. The German commanders, peering through their cupolas, were no longer hunting unsupported riflemen. They were now advancing toward freshly unloaded Sherman tanks guarding the beach exits. They were driving into established screens of 57mm anti-tank guns already dug into the Norman hedgerows. And above all, they were advancing into the pre-registered crosshairs of Allied naval cruisers and battleships, whose massive offshore artillery functioned as floating, highly accurate siege guns. The operational irony was absolute. The centralized command system, designed specifically to preserve Germany's heavy armor for a perfect, decisive blow, had achieved the exact opposite. By withholding the tanks until the strategic picture was perfectly clear, the High Command guaranteed that the panzers would be thrown into a devastating tactical trap. As the columns of the Strategic Reserve finally rolled forward under the relentless glare of the afternoon sun, their commanders faced a grim realization. Listening to the drone of Allied fighter bombers circling unchallenged above the road networks, the tank crews understood exactly what was happening. They were no longer executing a decisive counterstroke. They were being ordered to execute Erwin Rommel's absolute worst nightmare. The massive Maybach engines roared, pushing thousands of tons of steel onto the French routes nationale. The Panther and Panzer IV tanks of the elite reserves finally had their orders. But as they ground into high gear, the reality of the 12-hour delay immediately manifested in the sky above them. The morning cloud cover had broken. The afternoon sun brightly illuminated the winding roads leading toward Caen and the coast, casting long shadows that made the massive armored columns impossible to hide. Above them, the airspace was completely saturated. Swarms of British Hawker Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts prowled the Normandy road networks in overlapping, relentless shifts. With virtually no Luftwaffe fighters left to contest them, the Allied pilots treated the French countryside as a free-fire zone. They had spent the entire morning searching for any sign of German reinforcements heading toward the beachheads. Now, thanks to the paralyzing friction of the German command structure, the High Command had served up their most prized armored assets in broad daylight, heavily concentrated and neatly lined up on the main thoroughfares. The destruction began almost the moment the divisions broke cover. Before the forward elements of formations like the Panzer Lehr Division could even reach their designated tactical assembly areas, the sky tore open. The terrifying, high-pitched scream of diving aircraft drowned out the deep rumble of tank treads. High-explosive rockets and armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into the columns. A 45-ton Panther tank was an undisputed apex predator in a ground-level duel. But trapped on a narrow, cratered road, flanked by impenetrable Norman hedgerows, it was reduced to a slow-moving, highly combustible target. The unified, overwhelming counterpunch that Gerd von Rundstedt had envisioned instantly disintegrated. There was no grand armored clash, no sweeping tactical maneuvers. It was simply an execution. German commanders were forced to scream through their radios, ordering their drivers off the main roads. Tank crews frantically sought desperate, inadequate concealment under the thin canopy of roadside orchards or in the shadows of village stone walls. But there was nowhere to hide a fully mechanized division in motion. The soft, vital, logistical tail that kept the heavy armor fighting, the fuel trucks, the ammunition carriers, the unprotected half-tracks, were mercilessly strafed. They were ripped apart and left burning on the asphalt. The routes to the coast rapidly became choked with the smoking husks of destroyed supply vehicles, trapping the surviving heavy tanks behind impassable, flaming barricades. The physical loss of machinery was devastating, but the bleeding away of time was fatal. A march to the front line that should have been a rapid, overnight repositioning under the safety of darkness devolved into a grueling, bloody crawl. German tank commanders, officers accustomed to dictating the relentless pace of blitzkrieg, found themselves pinned down and completely paralyzed. They could only inch their heavy armor forward during the brief, unpredictable gaps between Allied air patrols, ultimately forcing them to halt entirely and wait agonizingly for the sun to set. Armored divisions that had been expected to smash into the beaches on the afternoon of June 6th would not arrive in concentrated force until days later. And when the battered, fragmented remnants of these once elite columns finally limped into the combat zone, the tactical reality had left them behind. The operation they had been ordered to execute was completely obsolete. They did not find isolated paratroopers or vulnerable infantry struggling in the surf. They found an entrenched, expanding, industrialized front line. The burning wrecks left scattered across the French road network were not merely the victims of Allied air supremacy. They were the physical embodiment of a broken chain of command. Every shattered tank, every burning fuel truck, and every cratered road represented the final, brutal receipt for every ignored warning, every localized hesitation, and every hour spent waiting for authorization from a man sleeping hundreds of miles away. To fully grasp the magnitude of this failure, we have to look away from the burning convoys of the late afternoon and return to the eerie quiet of dawn on June 6th. Picture again those hundreds of panzers parked along the French tree lines, their engines cold, their crews waiting in the morning mist, while American and British landing craft were hitting the sand just a few miles away. History rightfully remembers D-Day as a massive triumph of Allied industrial might, logistical genius, and raw human courage. But the German defeat during those critical early hours was not inflicted by enemy artillery or aerial bombardment. It was entirely self-inflicted. It was a structural collapse. The Nazi command architecture was a system obsessed with control. It was meticulously designed by a paranoid regime to prevent insubordination, to ensure that no rogue general could launch an unauthorized campaign, and to keep ultimate power concentrated safely at the very top. But in its quest for absolute political control, the regime engineered absolute military paralysis. It built a machine that operated perfectly on paper, yet completely disintegrated upon contact with the chaotic, highly accelerated pace of an actual invasion. The fatal flaw of June 6th was not a lack of tanks, but the vast, unbridgeable disconnect between sight and power. The local commanders who were close enough to see the danger, the men who felt the ground shake from naval gunfire, who watched the horizon fill with ships, and who knew exactly what had to be done, were deliberately stripped of the power to act. Meanwhile, the men who actually possessed the authority to unleash the armor were sitting in a Bavarian mountain retreat, entirely disconnected from the physical reality of the battlefield, staring at static maps and demanding impossible certainty before they would commit their forces. We cannot know if an immediate, concentrated Panzer counterattack at dawn would have actually succeeded. The Allied naval guns were devastating, and the sheer volume of invading infantry was overwhelming. It is entirely possible that even with perfect, instantaneous authorization, the German armor would have ultimately been broken on the beaches. But because of the bureaucratic labyrinth they built for themselves, the German military never even got the chance to find out. The steel was sitting right there in the French countryside, fueled and heavily armed, but the authority to turn the tracks was missing. A swift, concentrated panzer strike at dawn might not have guaranteed a German victory on D-Day, given the sheer scale of the Allied armada anchored just offshore. But a paralyzed, fearful chain of command ensured they never even got the chance to try. In the end, the most lethal weapons in the German arsenal were defeated not by the enemy in front of them, but by the very system designed to command them.